Welcome to this Oasis podcast, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Glyn Fussell, and I am one of the Oasis directors. In this series, I'll be introducing you to some fascinating people we know and work with. People who lead, people who coach, people who facilitate and develop others, and the organisations they're part of. We offer you their points of view to spark inspiration and insight to help you, your teams and your organisation make a positive impact in practice and through relationship. In this episode, Reimagining Leadership, we'll be meeting Claire Maxwell. Claire is chair of the Globally Responsible Leadership Initiative and an Oasis Associate Director with many years' experience of working to develop responsible, courageous leadership in a wide variety of different contexts around the world. We'll be exploring her insights into the kind of leadership needed for what can seem like a very uncertain future, the kind of attributes and skills leaders need, and how to create an environment where those kinds of skills can be developed and valued. Well, welcome, Claire. It's lovely to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me.
And this is a really fascinating time to start talking about leadership. Given all that's happening in the world. And I'm just wondering what's interesting for you about leadership. Why is this on your agenda?
For me, it's about power. So I'm really have always been, ever since I was a child, very interested in how relationships work, how power dynamics work. I had an interesting family background, and I'm watching and learning about who's in charge, how they operate, what they say, how power is manifested. And I think we're living in an extraordinary time in terms of how power and different approaches are manifesting themselves at the moment.
Yeah. And when we were preparing for this, I think we were talking about the bringing some lightness into the conversation, and it's difficult to see how to do that at the moment.
I'll do my best.
yeah, and it may not be possible, but let's see. And I've introduced you in this podcast as the chair of the GRLI. Can you just say a little bit about what that is?
The GRLI, we're an inclusive global community of action and learning. So action, making an impact, making a difference is critically important to us. And we would describe our essential intent is to be radically challenging in terms of what it means to be globally responsible in how we learn, how we live our lives, and how we lead.
So what sort of stakeholders are involved with the GRLI? What's the membership?
We don't talk about members. We're not a membership organisation, and that distinction is very important to us. So we're a global community, and we talk about being partners of the GRLI. And the partnership is held within a very strong governance structure, but also is inclusive of strategic partners. And our strategic partners, we have both American/international representation through the AACSB and European international representation through the European Federation of Management Development. And EFMD, alongside the United Nations Global Compact, was one of the founding parents of the GRLI.
And more broadly, what sort of organisations would want to join the GRLI?
Our partnership comprises of representatives from institutions, academic, and also from worldwide businesses, all of whom are committed to building a better world. They're purposeful in terms of wanting to both put something back into society, but also to work together collaboratively on behalf of people and planet.
Well, hence the globally responsible part of the title.
Exactly, Glyn. Exactly.
Yeah. And at some stage in your involvement with the GRLI, you have agreed to be the chair. What was it you were hoping to offer through doing that?
Well, that's a very good question. I wanted to offer energetic support for the work of the GRLI. So we talk about being the best for the world, but rather than being the best in the world. So not growing for growth's sake, having it unique impact that hasn't been done anywhere else. That originally we had a sunset clause, which was to 2024, which meant that if our work was done, we would cease to exist. Or if our work hadn't been achieved, we would cease to exist because it meant that we were redundant. And so there's a high level of humility and lack of ego in the way that the GRLI has been constructed. And I felt that it was something that aligned very closely with my values, and that I wanted to support the GRLI to bring the connection with OASIS, because OASIS was the OASIS School of Human Relations was one of the founding partners of the GRLI, and to deepen and enhance the whole person learning approach that the GRLI operates.
And in the time that you've been involved, have you seen any sort of tangible outputs from the work that you've all been doing?
Yes, I have. I think the one of the major difficulties is that the GRLI works through partnership. It isn't an entity that necessarily engages in its own activities for its own sake. But we have been primarily involved in developing what we've called Deans and Directors cohorts, Deans as agents of change. And we've had over 60 deans and directors from leading institutions from across the world meeting together in very participative, very experiential processes to look at how we might help to change at a systemic level, both the way that management education, business education is taught, but also the way in which business education is structured around the world.
And you mentioned the whole person approach that's enshrined in the way that you work together with your partners. Can you say a little bit about the significance of that from your perspective?
It means a great deal to me. It's certainly one of the things that drew me to the OASIS School in the first instance was that emphasis upon leading and learning with the whole of ourselves. So not just our intellect, but also with our heart, with our emotional intelligence, also physical well-being. And what I loved about OASIS, and also an element of the work that we're doing with the deans and directors, is bringing in the spirit or the soul or the more transpersonal, the element that is intangible and is hard to describe, but we know when it's present. And what we fundamentally believe is that when all of those elements, when the head, heart, the soul, the hands are united, then real change occurs at all levels, both individually, in societies and communities, and systemically.
And as someone who themselves is involved with the OASIS School, it's interesting for me to hear you say that. What I've noticed in the world of business in particular is that kind of language is being used more frequently, the whole person. But the manifestation of that isn't necessarily as courageous as I would believe is necessary to make real change. If you really do engage all those aspects of a person, it tends to be different from the kind of professional veneer that people associate with business. Do you relate to that? Is that something that means anything to you?
It completely does mean something to me, and I think it's beautifully put. There is something. So the business of academic business is historically and traditionally to develop a fine brain in order to be able to think one's way through complexity, through complicated situations, to manage and deal. And I think that academia and business schools in particular have done a brilliant job at that. When the context is stable, when it is known, and when there is a kind of linear development through society, communities, and we are going for an economic bottom line, there absolutely makes sense. Where it falters somewhat, and where the enlightened academics who are part of our Deans and Directors cohort and the GRLI, what they're recognizing is that the intellect is insufficient unto itself to do that job. We have to strengthen our emotional capabilities and competencies. We have to make sure that we are well physically and strong and robust to be able to manage. To do that requires, as you quite rightly say, that requires recognizing the importance of all of those elements. And sometimes when we're in be strong mode, or we're getting on, talking about our emotions or talking about our physical well-being can be seen as a weakness. And so we have to be prepared to kind of reverse the mindset, to see the intellect as simply one of the intelligences that we need to apply to the world we're in.
I love the way you've put that. Try telling that to Donald Trump, by the way.
Well, we were doing really well in the GRLI. I think we were feeling that there was an alignment between the more qualitative nature of our work and the direction of travel. And so one of the reasons why the sunset clause was extended to 2030 was because our board and our governance processes and our partners, all of whom we consult on a regular basis, felt that our work was certainly not done. It was required even more now.
One of the reasons why I was so keen to hear from you is, as well as being a key leader in the GRLI, you're also someone who for many years has been a practitioner, helping develop leaders to be more responsible, to be more self-aware. And you said a little bit at the beginning about what drew you into that kind of work. But when you think about the experience of leadership development from your perspective within organizations, what are the kinds of things that have been predominant or important in that process from your perspective?
The best way I can describe this, if I understand the question correctly, and do stop me if I'm going off on a tangent. One of the first management jobs that I had, I would call it that, was as a matron in a residential care home for older people. And I left London to go into social work and basically got a job as a care assistant. And I learned really, really early on, and painfully at times, how a system can dominate and rule the lives of sentient human beings, and sometimes vulnerable human beings who. So we were all victims of a system that was about routine and regime rather than humanity, integrity, respect, and care. Although there were elements of those present. And I learned tons about how the importance of communication, good relationships, ensuring that the pain that people were feeling when imposed change happened, that they were as involved as they possibly could be. Those people who think they're in charge are often not in charge in those kinds of institutions. So it was the cook who ruled and the matron who thought she did. And it's fascinating and massive learning from a very early age about how the system can both support but also stifle.
And I completely resonate with that. I think what I'd add from my perspective is what's been important to me, at least, is helping leaders become more aware of that system and their relationship with it. So that kind of sense of how aligned people are or can be with the context in which they work, that for me requires people to step into being willing to be more self-aware. And that can be quite frightening because becoming more self-aware might mean I don't want to work here anymore.
I think you're absolutely right. One of the greatest gifts, I think, that the development process that I've been on both through Oasis and outside of it, through experience, really, which has been my dearest teacher, has been, the ancient Greek aphorism of know thyself. And that willingness to delve into the shadowy places of the self has meant that the confidence that I have to be able to say yes to chairing an international foundation has come not from a grandiose sense of my own importance, quite the opposite. It's come from a sense of humility about the journey that I've been on, and also that on that journey I have taken the risks of knowing myself better, but through the company of others. And that's, I think, that's a great challenge. But in engaging in that journey, it then enables you to face external challenges much more confidently.
And that's a shift from a paradigm which would say the opposite to that. I remember having a chief executive at one stage in my life who said very angrily to me, I didn't get where I am today by thinking about my motivation for things.
Oh yeah, no, I had a great one as well, which was okay, Claire, when you become a manager, the thing that you must do is leave yourself at the door. You do not bring your personal stuff in here. The staff don't want to know what you've been doing in the evenings. This is about a professional persona. And for me, I envisaged every time I went in through that door, I had visions of kind of, as I took my coat off, I hung myself up on the coat hook and left myself there so I could become an automaton almost of professional rightness. But it broke down eventually because there is a humanity, a desperate need for humanity in the work that we do.
And I think as I hear you say that, I think there's something about that paradigm, that locked down kind of professional, leave yourself at the door, don't feel anything, and definitely don't express your feelings, comes from a sense of trying to create an illusion of safety. And that's gone.
Yes.
It's gone from our world.
Hurrah.
Yeah.
That's what I said to that. Yeah. It does. It comes from from knowing. It comes from you. I remember again once we were in a meeting and everything was going slightly wrong. And the general sense around the senior exec meeting was when we get out there, just have an answer. It doesn't matter if it's right or wrong, but you've got to be seen to as if you know. Do not ever say you don't know, because that will create a sense of panic and uncertainty amongst staff. And that's the whole parent-child dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah. And there's something deeply reassuring, I think, in that dynamic. It can be hard to let go of if that's what you've grown up with, if that's the culture that you're used to living in.
Exactly.
Whether you're the parent or the child in that paradigm, it's familiar at least.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as you say, quite rightly, hard to let go of. And sometimes, ironically, and this was very much came to the fore in the work that I did with the Housing Association, where we completely reoriented the internal culture, was that sometimes, and it's a paradox, you have to force people to be collaborative. You have to say, look, this is how it's going to be. And it's such a strange juxtaposition between what eventually you want to create, which is more power sharing, more empowerment, more of a devolved leadership style.
One of the things I was planning on asking you is, and it is linked to what you just said to an extent, is when you look around you now at the world, and there's enormous diversity of stuff going on at the moment, but the kind of prevailing wind of leadership characteristics doesn't seem that great. If we look at some of the world leaders or even our own national leaders, I'm just wondering if you had noticed any emerging characteristics of leadership that worry you at this time.
Oh yes, yes, definitely. So for me, this is a climate of huge potential. That's how I see it. However, I know that I am living in a climate where fear and uncertainty exist and often potentially rule. And I think about the news this morning and what's happening around the world, and particularly, for example, in America. So what I see is the potential for a growing shift back to individualism and nationalism. So the way that we've worked with the pandemic hasn't been global, and in fact, the World Health Organization has been rubbished publicly by nations. The very fabric of the societies that the world that we have constructed, which is about interdependence, everything is connected. We are all interdependent in some way, has been fragmented, and nations have moved inward to look after themselves. Whereas what's round the corner, and I know I'm trying to keep this light, but this is perhaps the deepest, darkest question. Round the corner, I know I believe we have an economic recession, and we have pandemic is masking climate change, all of which requires, from my perspective, a global response. The countries need to come together. It's not something that's only going to be national. And in terms of leadership, what worries me is that, again, and it links to what we were saying before, Glyn, about parent-child, is that in times of fear and uncertainty, I may wish for, hope for, and indeed somehow make manifest a leader that says they know what to do, that they have the answer. And in my own personal history, often that's a white man. I fear for that, because I do not believe that single individualistic leadership is the way forward.
Mm. And linked to that, this crisis as a potential once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for change.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. If we can get past what's been termed crisis exhaustion, and take our freedoms, take our civil rights, take our responsibilities, take the will to act in a different kind of way. Wow! What could we co-create in this world that will mean that the planet, that people, that our societies, our communities are healthy? That we've got such a really, I think, a unique opportunity at this time in our world.
I'm really struck with all that you're saying, that at the centre of your philosophical position on leadership is a deeply political worldview.
Yes, I don't consider myself to be a particularly active political activist. And that comes, I think, from a love of being a practitioner. I learn from experience. I learn from making mistakes and all those kinds of things. But yes, absolutely at the core of my being, although I wouldn't wish to categorize myself in any particular political place, is a very strong sense of community, of collectivism, I think. Yeah, it would have to be.
And that people have a right to be involved and engaged in decisions which directly impact on their lives.
Exactly. And that was at the core. There were a couple of critical principles that were at the core of developing very, very intensely complicated and rich shared leadership processes for organizations, and what attracted me to the JRLI, because we're a peer-based organization, peer-based entity.
So there's something here about, I think, giving some tangibility to what this opportunity could afford. And as we're quite definitely in the middle of it, I'm personally finding it difficult to see what those opportunities are. in the real organisations that I'm working in. Now, I think that there's something about how they reorganise themselves, the way that they govern, the way that decisions are made. But for me, we've been talking for years in Oasis about taking an up close and personal approach to leadership, that it really is about engaging with the self as the primary instrument of change. What I've heard from you is that alongside that, there's something more systemic that needs to shift as well.
Yeah.
That might enable more of that.
Yes, the GRLI has its symbol. It has 3 elliptical spheres, and they represent the I, the we, and the all of us. And they're interconnected. What we talk about is that the impetus for change, the trigger for change, the element that I have the most control over is myself. I'm able to influence how I spend, how I manifest my values in the world. And they will have an impact then on the organization, the team, the community that I operate within. And those are changes that to some extent I am able to influence quite intently and quite immediately. The more difficult is when I want to effect change at a systemic level, when I want to change the systems and the processes. And from my perspective, that's when we must operate together, because I can't do that on my own. I have to be in the company of like-minded and like-hearted people who have a desire, an intent that fits with my own values, and collectively there is a greater opportunity for movement if we work together on this, regardless of where we may be, whether it's in the same organization, the same community, the same team, wherever. So I'm absolutely with you. I think there are massive opportunities here if we do not rush to action too soon.
And this is a potentially slightly odd question, but if you imagine there being a kind of spectrum between utter dejection and pessimism and optimism about that being possible at all in the world, where would you place yourself at the moment?
Oh, that's a good question. I have thought about this. Where am I between annihilation and nirvana? I think I place myself. This is where I am. I place myself on the end towards annihilation, but facing what I would term nirvana, but the opportunity for a better world. And my feet are very, very grounded, and there is a sunshine, the back. So I'm facing away from the shadow, but I'm quite close to it. I see the potential quite a long way away, which is why I think we've got to take the smallest but the most determined of steps towards the lighter side, towards the other end of the spectrum.
Mm. And you yourself have been intimately involved in helping develop an organisation to orient itself towards having a more distributed approach to leadership in the housing sector. They were they were the first, I think, in the UK to win Investors in People Platinum Award for the way that they work with people. I am confident, and from what I've seen of that work, that there are tangible benefits for people in being involved in creating a more optimistic future together.
You're right. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
But what kinds of obstacles have there been to orienting the organisation differently in that context?
Lord. Well, first of all, I would say that I would completely agree with you that one of the reasons why a more distributed or shared, or what we've most latterly called relational leadership approach has worked in the housing association is because the CEO had the vision, the foresight, the wisdom actually to recognize that directive leadership on its own would be insufficient to meet the volatility and the complexity that was then coming towards us. And we kind of looked at that with a sort of, oh, yes, it's going to be really tricky, isn't it? Yes, there's going to be all sorts of things happening, without ever thinking of what it really could be. We thought economic, we thought political, and so on. But the pandemic, we never thought about at all. But she had that foresight. She understood that it wasn't going to work if she was expected to have all the answers and to simply direct from some kind of, eerie, some kind of isolated office. The greatest challenge was opening the organization up to exploration. And by that, I mean that as a first step, there was what was then called a well-being audit undertaken, in which everyone in the organization was invited to give a view relating to a number of critical questions about how the organization was operating. And it was done with enormous transparency, enormous integrity, in that the person that was engaging the people who were engaged in the process were anonymous, and every ounce of safety that could be put in place was put in place. And the feedback, some of the feedback that came back was extraordinarily demanding to hear. Because often, as we both know, executive teams, even the most connected and the most wonderful, will have sometimes a distorted view of what's happening in an organization because people won't tell them what's really going on. And so here suddenly was information coming directly to a senior team, and it was incredibly useful for kickstarting a process that was then about co-creating, at that point with managers and with the exec team, a vision for the future. And I think this is what I feel very strongly about. That there have to be things that are attended to in organizations and businesses, particularly at the moment, to survive. But if we can create the opportunity to formulate visions with others of the kind of world that we want to see going forward, where we want to go, developing a shared clarity vision, that in itself provides enormous opportunities for people to see themselves in that future and to feel that they have the strength to influence it. One of the challenges is that not everybody wants to do that. And so how do you create the context, the environment, the platform by which everyone can see the future, but also have the opportunity to in that future to perhaps see that they don't belong in it? But not to be moved on or shifted out, but to have really robust adult-to-adult conversations about what does that mean.
I completely get that. I think there's that, going back to the conversation we were having earlier about the parent-child dynamic that we've grown up with, actually, that there is a longing for that in some people, and it's hard for them to let go of it. Yeah,
it is. And my experience is that often there were other places, lots of other places that people could go to. I grew up, in effect, my long-term relationship has been with local authorities. And one of the great joys in a local authority is that you can fall back on positional power and responsibility. That's not my job. That belongs to somebody else. Just tell me what you want me to do and I'll go away and do it. And so there were always places where people who didn't want to have that degree of influence or responsibility could go. But my sense is those places are increasingly few and far between. That most organizations, most businesses are waking up to, and particularly waking into, a sense that there has to be higher levels of collaboration, of relationship, of robust adult-to-adult maturity if we're going to face into that which is coming towards us.
So this is let's get practical. So imagine that I am a chief executive or a leader of any kind within an organization at any level. Hello. And I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, oh, that all sounds really highfalutin. Yeah. What do I do? What's a useful first step that I could take to make a difference?
To make a difference in your organization?
Yeah. So if the desire is to create leadership that's suitable for what really is an uncertain future, what can I start by doing?
Well, Mr. Fussell, what you could start by doing, I believe, is that you could start with exploring your own relationship to power. So how much do you really want to develop a collaborative or shared or distributed leadership within this organization? Because that's a big thing. Why do you want to do it? What's your motivations for wanting to do it? How do you feel about the nature of letting go of some of the things that you may have spent a long time developing? What's your relationship to status? What's your relationship to where's your ego in this? And those kind of questions are extremely hard to respond to, and they're not asked with any judgment at all. It's not. It's simply to locate the person and then the team in how much can you really stand in terms of a spectrum of shared leadership. So I think I would recommend that you spend some time with somebody external who is willing to go where this needs to go in terms of working out what you really can and want to develop and what your core values are. So when the going gets tough, which believe me, it does at times, that you can collectively step back into remind yourselves and resurrect your core values about why on earth you're doing this in the first place.
So I'm still with the practicality thing.
Yeah, so you've done that.
Yeah.
So you've done that. So you have a strong sense of what it is that you want to develop in the organization as a shared leadership approach. And then you start to do it. So how do you share that vision? And my recommendation would be, to begin with, is that you would work with critical or key players within the organization and start to co-create, to author a sense of what the critical elements are in the organization that need to be attended to, but from a different leadership perspective.
And this is a slightly devil's advocate a comment, but given that most organizations at present are in either what you described as crisis fatigue or having to respond to what's going on, or thinking about reintegration back into their offices, or how possible do you think it would be in that context to step back and think in the way that you just described?
If I don't want to do it because it's too hard, I would see it as impossible. And I think that's the fundamental thing. I don't think it's impossible. The people that I'm working with, the CEOs that I'm working with, don't think it's impossible. In fact, they consider it to be absolutely essential that at this time of intense activity and intense activity, that they stop, they pause. It might not be for as long, but they pause with enough time to attend to their own well-being and the well-being of their team, but also to start to think about what it is that they want to develop going forward. What is the vision that they have that is not business as usual? So, but it's not a leap into the future. So, what is it that we are learning about where we are now? That, I think, is one of the most important first steps. What's working? Where are we vulnerable? How are our values standing up to challenge? Where are the opportunities to develop or enhance what it is that we're currently doing? What are we learning about ourselves? And critically for me, Glyn, what are some of the assumptions that I am taking into this new step with me? So it goes back to what you were saying. I might be assuming in an exec team that actually, a bit of a blip. I know, it's been unpleasant and difficult, but, everything will go back to normal fairly soon. And the sooner we can do that, the better. Others may think, actually, this is only the beginning of a series of really significant things. Now, if in an exec team, there are those differences in assumption, that will affect how that senior team views how the organization needs to shape itself going forward. So for me, taking the time, it doesn't have to be lengthy, but having the time to have the conversation about what is the core assumption that we are as an executive team or as a management group or whoever it might be, what is the core assumption that we're working about from in going forward? Because that will affect how we see technology, it'll affect how we see behaviors, it will affect how we see relationships, and so on.
Mm-hmm. That's a fantastic answer, Claire. Thank you. And I just wonder, as we're coming to the end now of the conversation today, is there anything that you would want to add?
I don't think so. I think it's been such a wonderful opportunity to hear myself speak some of the things that mean a great deal to me.
Yes.
I think that the only things that I would like to add are around perhaps some of the themes that I've seen. But there's two in particular, and one is that authenticity. That is knowing thyself is as relevant as it's ever been, and recognizing that what we've termed to soft skills, because I really get so irate about this when people talk about, it's just, those are the soft skills. Actually, the soft skills are the hardest skills of all. And
Amen.
If we could only recognize that if I am developed in those relational elements of life, then I will be so much of a greater leader than anything that can be taught about the harder end of things.
Yes, absolutely agree with you. Claire, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for asking me. It's been joyous, and thank you, Glyn.
Yeah, take care.
Okay, and you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this Oasis podcast. We hope you've enjoyed listening and that it's given you plenty of food for thought. You can subscribe to our podcast series and listen out for the next episode. And if you'd like to know more about the work we do or to get in touch with us, do so via our website, oasishumanrelations.org.uk. Thank you.